Dad left me his entire fortune, but only if I never contact my gold-digger stepmother. She's been harassing me for 2 years now. My father passed away 3 years ago, and I'm still dealing with the aftermath of his death in ways I never expected. When the lawyer read his will, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Dad had left me everything: his house, his investments, his business interests, even his collection of vintage cars that he'd spent decades building. The catch was something that seemed almost too bizarre to be real at first. The inheritance came with one ironclad condition: I could never, under any circumstances, initiate contact with my stepmother. Not a phone call, not a text message, not even a Christmas card. If I reached out to her in any way, I would forfeit the entire inheritance and it would go to a wildlife conservation charity instead. At the time, this seemed like the easiest condition in the world to follow. My stepmother and I had never gotten along anyway, and after Dad's funeral, I figured we'd naturally drift apart and never speak again. Boy, was I wrong about that. My stepmother had married my father when I was 16, just 2 years after my mother died from cancer. Even as a teenager, I could see right through her act. She was 23 years younger than Dad, had no job, no education beyond high school, and seemed to appear out of nowhere. She'd flutter her eyelashes and talk about how much she loved older, established men who could take care of her. Dad was completely smitten, probably because he was still grieving Mom and desperately lonely. I tried to warn him, but he wouldn't listen. He was convinced that she genuinely loved him and that I was just having trouble accepting a new woman in our lives. Looking back, I can understand why he needed to believe that. Losing Mom had destroyed him, and my stepmother made him feel alive again, even if it was all an act. The marriage lasted 8 years, and during that time I watched her slowly but systematically work her way into every aspect of Dad's life. She convinced him to put her name on bank accounts, to buy expensive jewelry and cars for her, to take lavish vacations that cost more than most people make in a year. She also made it clear that I wasn't welcome in their home anymore once I turned 18. What really hurt was watching Dad change. He used to be sharp, independent, and confident in his decisions. But around her, he became almost childlike, constantly seeking her approval and bending over backward to make her happy. She had this way of pouting and withdrawing affection whenever she didn't get what she wanted, and Dad would panic and give in to whatever she was asking for. When Dad got sick with heart problems in his final year, I tried to reconcile with him. I visited him in the hospital, and we had some good conversations where he seemed more like his old self. He even admitted that he had some regrets about how things had gone between us. But my stepmother was always hovering around, monitoring our conversations and making sure I didn't stay too long. After Dad died, I learned from his lawyer that he had changed his will multiple times in the last few months of his life. The final version, signed just 3 weeks before he passed, was the one that left everything to me with that strange condition about not contacting my stepmother. The lawyer mentioned that Dad had been very specific about the wording and had insisted on including detailed instructions about what would constitute contact. At first, my stepmother seemed to accept the will without much fuss. She inherited a modest amount of money that Dad had set aside for her, plus she got to keep some jewelry and personal items. It wasn't nothing, but it was a far cry from the fortune she probably expected to receive as his widow. I figured she'd take her inheritance and disappear from my life forever. That peaceful period lasted exactly 6 months. Update 1. The harassment started small and gradually escalated into something I never could have imagined. It began with my stepmother showing up at places where she knew I'd be. She'd appear at the grocery store I always went to, the gym where I had a membership, even the coffee shop where I liked to work on my laptop. At first, she'd just stare at me from across the room, making sure I saw her but not approaching directly. Then she started following me. I'd catch glimpses of her car in my rearview mirror when I was driving home from work. She'd park across the street from my apartment building and just sit there for hours. When I'd look out my window, I could see her watching my building through binoculars. It was creepy and unsettling, but technically she wasn't contacting me directly, so I couldn't risk responding without violating Dad's will. The psychological games got more elaborate as time went on. She began sending messages through other people. She'd call my friends, my coworkers, even distant relatives, spinning sob stories about how Dad's will had been unfair and how she was struggling financially. She'd hint that if I would just talk to her, we could work out some kind of arrangement that would be better for both of us. These mutual acquaintances would then approach me with messages from her, not realizing they were being used as pawns in her scheme. They'd tell me she seemed really desperate and maybe I should consider reaching out just to hear what she had to say. I had to explain the situation over and over again, and some people thought I was being unnecessarily cruel by not at least having one conversation with her. The worst part was that she was technically following the rules of Dad's will. She wasn't contacting me directly, so I couldn't accuse her of trying to sabotage my inheritance. But she was making my life miserable in ways that felt calculated and deliberate. Every time I left my apartment, I had to wonder if she'd be lurking somewhere nearby. Every phone call from an unknown number made my heart race, thinking it might be her trying a new approach. She also started spreading rumors about me in our small community. She'd tell people that I had manipulated Dad when he was sick and vulnerable, that I had turned him against his loving wife during his final months. She painted herself as the grieving widow who had been cruelly cut out of her husband's will by his selfish daughter. Some people believed her stories, especially those who didn't know our family history well. The financial pressure she was putting on herself became apparent when she started making increasingly desperate attempts to get my attention. She began showing up at my workplace, not to talk to me directly, but to cause scenes that would force me to notice her. She'd stand in the parking lot crying loudly, telling anyone who would listen about how unfairly she'd been treated. She'd call my office pretending to be a client, then hang up when she heard my voice. I realized she was probably running out of money faster than she'd expected. Dad's modest inheritance to her wouldn't have lasted long given her expensive lifestyle, and she'd never had any kind of career or income of her own. She'd spent 8 years living as a kept woman, and now she was facing the reality of having to support herself for the first time in her adult life. But the most disturbing escalation came when she started involving my neighbors. She'd knock on doors in my apartment building, introducing herself as my stepmother and asking if they'd seen any concerning behavior from me. She'd hint that she was worried about my mental health and stability, suggesting that I might be dangerous or unpredictable. She was clearly trying to turn the people around me against me, or at least make them suspicious of me. Living under this constant surveillance and harassment was exhausting. I found myself changing my routines, avoiding places I enjoyed, and constantly looking over my shoulder. I couldn't go on a date without wondering if she'd show up and cause a scene. I couldn't meet friends for dinner without worrying that she'd somehow involve them in her schemes. The inheritance that was supposed to provide security and freedom was starting to feel like a prison. Update 2. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, my stepmother's behavior took a turn that shocked even me. I discovered she had been systematically contacting every person from my past she could find, including people I hadn't spoken to in years. She tracked down my college roommates, my high school friends, even my ex-boyfriends, spinning elaborate stories about how I'd stolen her rightful inheritance through manipulation and lies. The most painful part was when she contacted my mother's sister, my aunt who lived across the country. My aunt called me in tears, saying that my stepmother had told her I was struggling with mental health issues and needed intervention. She claimed that I was living in isolation, burning through Dad's money recklessly, and showing signs of paranoid behavior. My aunt, who I only spoke to a few times a year, was genuinely concerned and wanted to fly out to check on me. Having to explain the real situation to my grieving aunt, who was still dealing with the loss of both my mother and my father, was heartbreaking. She'd had no idea about the extent of my stepmother's manipulative behavior over the years, and learning about it brought back painful memories of how my mother's death had been exploited by someone who never truly cared about our family. But the most shocking discovery came when I found out that my stepmother had been in contact with Dad's lawyer. She'd been trying to challenge the will, claiming that Dad had been mentally compromised when he made the final changes. She'd hired her own attorney and was building a case that Dad had been suffering from early-stage dementia and that I had taken advantage of his condition to influence the will in my favor. This legal challenge terrified me more than anything else she'd done. If she could prove that Dad wasn't of sound mind when he changed his will, everything would be reversed. She'd inherit the bulk of his estate and I'd be left with nothing. Worse, if the court found that I had manipulated a mentally compromised elderly person, I could face serious legal consequences beyond just losing the inheritance. I had to hire my own legal team to defend against her challenge, which was expensive and emotionally draining. The lawyers had to dig through Dad's medical records, interview his doctors, and piece together evidence of his mental state during his final months. The process forced me to relive every painful moment of his illness and death, examining every conversation we'd had for signs of whether he'd been thinking clearly. The investigation revealed something I hadn't known. Dad had been keeping detailed journals during his final year, documenting his thoughts about his marriage, his relationship with me, and his concerns about my stepmother's true motivations. His handwriting was clear and coherent, his thoughts were organized and logical, and his reasoning for the will changes was laid out in careful detail. In his journal entries, Dad wrote about how he'd finally started to see through my stepmother's act during his illness. He described feeling used and manipulated, and he expressed deep regret about how he'd allowed her to drive a wedge between us. He wrote about wanting to make things right with me but being afraid of how she'd react if he tried to reconcile with me openly. Most importantly, the journals showed that the no-contact condition in the will wasn't meant to be cruel to me. Dad had realized that my stepmother would never stop trying to get her hands on his money, and he was trying to protect me from exactly the kind of harassment and manipulation I was experiencing. He knew that if there was any way for her to use me to access the inheritance, she'd never leave me alone. Reading Dad's private thoughts about our relationship and his marriage was both healing and devastating. I finally understood that he had seen through my stepmother's facade, but he'd felt trapped by his own choices and too proud to admit he'd made such a massive mistake. The will was his way of making amends and ensuring that his life's work would benefit the daughter he'd never stopped loving, even when it seemed like he'd chosen his new wife over me. The legal battle dragged on for months, during which my stepmother's harassment actually intensified. She seemed to sense that her court challenge was failing, and she became more desperate and erratic in her behavior. She started showing up at my apartment building at all hours, sometimes in the middle of the night, just standing outside and staring up at my windows. She'd leave strange items by my door, old photos of her and Dad, handwritten notes asking why I was being so cruel, even flowers like she was mourning someone. The breaking point came when she somehow got into my apartment building and left a package outside my door. Inside was a USB drive containing hours of audio recordings she'd made of Dad during his final illness. She'd secretly recorded conversations where he sounded confused and disoriented, probably during his worst moments when he was heavily medicated or experiencing complications from his heart condition. She'd edited these recordings to make it sound like Dad didn't know what he was doing when he changed his will, cutting out any context that would explain his condition at the time. It was a manipulative and disgusting violation of a dying man's privacy, and it showed just how far she was willing to go to get what she wanted. But her plan backfired spectacularly. When my lawyers presented the recordings to the court, along with Dad's medical records showing exactly when he'd been heavily sedated versus when he'd been alert and coherent, it became clear that she'd been manipulating evidence. The timestamps on the recordings didn't match the dates when Dad had made his will changes, and the medical records showed he'd been in a clear mental state during all his meetings with the lawyer. Final update. The court not only dismissed my stepmother's challenge to the will but also sanctioned her for attempting to present manipulated evidence. The judge was particularly harsh in his comments about secretly recording a dying spouse and then editing those recordings to misrepresent his mental state. My stepmother's own lawyer withdrew from the case, apparently unwilling to be associated with such unethical behavior. But the real turning point came from an unexpected source. One of Dad's old business partners reached out to me after hearing about the legal battle through mutual connections. He told me something that changed everything. My stepmother had been married before to another older man with money, and that marriage had ended under very similar circumstances. This business partner had known my stepmother's first husband, and he described an almost identical pattern of behavior. She'd married a widower 20 years her senior, gradually isolated him from his adult children, and then fought viciously over his estate when he died. The first husband's children had eventually settled with her out of court, essentially paying her to go away and stop harassing them. Armed with this information, my lawyers were able to dig deeper into my stepmother's past. What they found was a pattern of targeting vulnerable older men, marrying them quickly, and then fighting for their estates after they died. She'd done this at least 3 times before my father, always with the same basic approach: present herself as a loving younger woman who just wanted to be taken care of, then reveal her true nature only after she'd secured her position. The most disturbing discovery was that she'd been in contact with Dad's doctors during his illness, not out of genuine concern for his health, but to gather information she could use later to challenge his mental competency if needed. She'd been planning her legal strategy from the moment he got sick, which explained why she'd been so calm and accepting when the will was first read. This evidence of a long-term pattern of predatory behavior gave me the ammunition I needed to finally fight back. My lawyers filed a harassment complaint that documented everything she'd done over the past 2 years. The court issued a restraining order that prohibited her from coming within 500 feet of me, my home, or my workplace. More importantly, the evidence of her past marriages and the pattern of estate challenges allowed my lawyers to argue that she was engaging in a form of fraud. The court agreed, and my stepmother was ordered to pay my legal fees and was warned that any further attempts to challenge the will or harass me would result in criminal charges. The restraining order and the threat of criminal prosecution finally stopped the harassment. My stepmother seemed to realize that she'd pushed too far and that continuing to pursue me would likely result in serious legal consequences for her. She disappeared from my life as suddenly as she'd entered it, apparently moving to another state where she could start fresh with a new identity and new targets. The whole experience taught me something important about Dad's final gift to me. The inheritance wasn't just about money or property, it was about freedom from the toxic relationship that had poisoned our family for years. Dad had seen what my stepmother was capable of, and he'd structured his will not just to provide for me financially, but to protect me from her manipulation once he wasn't around to be her primary target. The no-contact condition that had seemed so strange at first made perfect sense in retrospect. Dad knew that any opportunity for my stepmother to interact with me would become an opportunity for her to manipulate, harass, or try to access his money through me. By making contact grounds for forfeiting the inheritance, he created a legal barrier that protected both his assets and his daughter from someone who would never stop trying to exploit both. I finally understood that Dad's love for me had never wavered, even during the years when it seemed like he'd chosen his new wife over his daughter. He'd been trapped in a relationship with someone who was skilled at emotional manipulation, but he'd found a way to break free and make things right, even if he couldn't do it while he was alive. Today, I'm living the life Dad wanted for me. I've used part of the inheritance to start a foundation that helps adult children of elderly people who've been targeted by predatory relationships. I've learned that what happened to Dad and me isn't uncommon, and there are many families out there dealing with similar situations where vulnerable older adults are exploited by people who pretend to love them. The foundation provides legal resources, emotional support, and education about the warning signs of elder financial abuse. We help families navigate the complex legal and emotional challenges that come with protecting their loved ones from predators while respecting their autonomy and dignity. I also kept Dad's vintage car collection, which has become a way for me to connect with his memory. Every weekend, I take one of his cars out for a drive, and I feel like he's with me in those moments. The cars represent his passion and his hard work, and maintaining them has become a way for me to honor his legacy beyond just preserving his financial assets. The house where I grew up, which Dad left to me, has been transformed into a space filled with love and laughter again. I've hosted family gatherings there, reconnecting with relatives I hadn't seen in years because my stepmother had made family events so uncomfortable. My aunt, who was so worried about me during the legal battle, now visits regularly, and we've rebuilt the relationship that had been strained by years of family drama. Looking back, I realized that Dad's final act wasn't just about money or property. It was about breaking a cycle of manipulation and abuse that could have continued indefinitely if he hadn't found a way to stop it. He gave me the tools to protect myself and the resources to help others in similar situations. The 2 years of harassment were terrible, but they also showed me how strong I could be when I had to fight for something important. I learned to stand up for myself, to seek help when I needed it, and to trust my instincts about people's motivations. Most importantly, I learned that sometimes the people who love us most make choices that seem hurtful in the moment but are actually meant to protect us in the long run. My stepmother is gone from my life now, but the lessons from dealing with her manipulation have made me more aware of predatory behavior in all its forms. I can spot the warning signs when someone is trying to exploit vulnerability or loneliness, and I'm not afraid to speak up when I see it happening to others. The inheritance that started as a blessing then felt like a curse has ultimately become exactly what Dad intended, a foundation for a life lived with purpose, surrounded by people who genuinely care about me. Free from the manipulation and toxicity that had shadowed our family for too long. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd violated the no-contact rule and tried to reason with my stepmother early on. But I know now that there was no reasoning with someone who saw other people only as means to an end. Dad understood that, and he structured his final gift to protect me from learning that lesson the hard way. The fortune he left me was never really about the money. It was about giving me the freedom to choose my own path, surrounded by people who love me for who I am rather than what I can provide for them. That's a gift that no amount of money could buy, and it's one that will last for the rest of my life.